All right, so our next presenter is Jessica C. White. Jessica grew up in Taiwan, where she learned to love storybooks and folk crafts, and now lives in Asheville, North Carolina, where she continues her studio practice and teaches printmaking, drawing, book arts, and papermaking at Warren Wilson College. Her practice revolves around, narrative relief prints, wood engravings, letterpress printing, and crankies, which you're going to learn a lot about today. She draws inspiration from folk tales, ghost stories, children's books, and the natural beauty of the Blue Ridge Mountains. Her work has been exhibited internationally and can be seen in public collections, including Yale University, Stanford University, Lingnan University, Hong Kong, and the Art Institute of Chicago. She holds degrees that include a BFA in sculpture from ECU, from Eastern Carolina University, and an MA and MFA in printmaking from the University of Iowa. Half of a pilot's license and half of a sailing certificate, so she can almost get us somewhere. But today she's going to take us into the wonderful world of crankies. So please welcome to the podium Jessica White.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out today. And I want to say a special thanks a lot to the Craft Guild for giving me this opportunity to talk about something that I love and I am always happy to talk about, which is books. Something that has been a part of my life since I was a little kid, and I feel like this is sort of such a special way to be able to make a living in the books that I've learned to love ever since I was a child, too. What I have today is a slideshow that came out of my academic lectures at school, and it is about how the books have evolved from scrolls to codexes that we know now. I just wanted to point that out because there are some times and dates and stuff on there. It looks like you're going to be getting a pop quiz at the end of this, but don't worry, I'm not going to quiz you on any of it. But that's where some of these come from. I'm going to be talking about this evolution of the book, the historical evolution of the book, but also how that evolution has affected my own practice as a book artist, and then also how that's evolved into what has happened here when I moved to Asheville, North Carolina, and learned about what I think of as a book structure, the cranky, which has its roots here in the Appalachian region. I know that maybe not everyone would call this thing a book, but I think just because I see my whole life through a book lens, this is what I've started calling them, and this is how I basically treat them in my own work. So we are going to start way back in Alexandria in Greece. You guys have probably heard about the very first library that has been created in Greece, and this is what it would have looked like. I wanted to just point out that if you were to walk into a library back then, it would have been shelves of scrolls, there would have been buckets full of scrolls, and there were people who were pulling out scrolls. And this is basically how information was created and reposited into a structure that worked. And it was partly because of the materials that were available. And at that time, the main material for collecting information was papyrus. And so this is coming out of Egypt. And so papyrus has a tendency to be very brittle. And so if you were to fold papyrus, it would actually break over time. So you can't really fold it and open it multiple times, but it rolls up really well. And so they had almost like this international domination over writing materials. Basically, they were the Amazon of the time. They were sending out papyrus to countries all over the world where they were making scrolls and keeping their information in. But another material that was often used for scrolls was the parchment, which is made from calfskin or goat skin. So you would also see a lot of parchment or vellum scrolls that were also made in the same way, which also has a tendency, depending on how thin the vellum or parchment is, it rolls really well, but it doesn't necessarily fold and open really well. Again, really nicely set to be used as a scroll. And then we go all the way over to China, where the most prevalent material that was used at that time was bamboo. And they were using bamboo strips in this way, where they were cutting bamboo into these long, thin strips and tying them up across the top and across the bottom as these strings. And then, of course, as you can see, the best way to store these is to roll them up as a scroll. Something that I love about seeing these bamboo strips is the way that you can see the writing. And traditional Chinese writing is still done in this way in printing, where you see it's vertical instead of horizontal. And that's basically because of the materials that were available. And as we as crafters and makers know, the materials tell us what needs to be done, right? And we work with the materials, let them be what they are. And this has ended up becoming what traditional Chinese writing tends to be, is vertical in these columns because of the bamboo they were working on. Now, also in China, this would have been in 200-300 AD, there was an invention called paper. It's an amazing new thing that they created that then kind of changed the way they used their bamboo. But you can see here that some similarities stayed. The vertical columns, the way they were writing, but then also the way that it was rolled up into a scroll. So even as a new material like paper came into being, it was being adapted to use as a scroll form, because this is basically what everybody knew and understood. And here's just an example of one of the earliest printed books. It is a scroll called the Diamond Sutra, and it was a information about the Buddhist writings at the time. It included text and an image, all carved into a single wooden block. They were printed onto these long strips of paper, and they were rolled up and put into these little stupas, these little wooden temples, and sent out all over the countryside. And this was in China, a way for the Chinese central government to send out teachings of the Buddhist teachings, and to also to increase the literacy rate as well too. So China had one of the earliest, most prevalent literacy rates, just basically because of this kind of practice. Here you see some of the beginnings of a scroll becoming what is called a codex, which is like a rectangular form where it's sort of bound along one side and opens and closes in books that we sort of know of today. But you can see how basically that bamboo scroll has now been folded along one edge, and it creates a rectangular sort of form, and then they put a board on top and a board on the bottom to protect it. And it's starting to look a lot more like the books that we know today. And then they started doing something similar with those paper scrolls too. So instead of rolling it up, they start to fold it in a way that becomes kind of an accordion style is what it's called. And in the same way they fold it up, it becomes a rectangle, put a board on top and a board on the bottom, usually wrapped up with a piece of twine, and then you've got a rectangular kind of book format. Now, across on the other side of the world, over in the Mayan civilization, we're talking about like Central Americas, there was another kind of a bookish structure that they were using for the information that they were collecting. A lot of that information had to do with the days in the calendars, their ritual plantings, the prophecies. I mean, they recorded basically everything into these structures that were made of bark paper. They were like beaten bark. And then they were folded up into something sort of like an accordion. But what's interesting is that when the early European colonizers showed up, they saw these structures. They didn't even call them books. They didn't know what to call them. And they described them as thin pieces of bark folded up like blankets. And so we know somehow of the ways that they were sort of folded up, a lot like these accordion folds, but they weren't even called books. They just didn't even recognize them as books. So here we are seeing how scrolls are evolving kind of all over the world. Around the same time period, we're talking about 2,000 years ago, early paper making times. But I just wanted to point out this place in northern Africa where the real evolution started to take place and started to take hold, and the book really evolved into what we know of it today. And it really has to do with Coptic Christians in northern Africa. And what they did was, I'm talking about a region right up here in Ethiopia, they were writing down the teachings of the Christians at the time and putting them into a different format because they wanted their religion, this brand new religion called Christianity, to stand out as something new. And they really wanted to be able to capture people's attention and also study it and learn it in a different way. So they wanted to create a book that was then from, instead of a linear reading kind of style where you go from the beginning to the end like in a scroll, you can actually flip through the pages and find one specific part of the text and one specific part of the text and read it all together. That's called indexical reading, basically like going to the index in the back of a book and choosing what page you want to go to and then opening that page. I usually like to tell people, imagine if you were in a church service and the pastor asked you to all turn to the book of Matthew 3:17, and if everybody pulled out their scrolls and had to like scroll through and try to find that same verse so that you could all read that same verse together, and how much trouble that would be. But instead, we can pull out a codex book and flip to that page, and instantly everybody in that whole room is in the same place studying the same thing. So this is not only a new religion with new teachings, but also a new way of learning a type of religion, a new way of studying a type of religion. Now, the reason we know a lot about these books and the reason that we still have some examples of them is because these Coptic Christians who traveled from Egypt down through this western side or eastern side of Africa into the Horn of Ethiopia. They were nomads, and this is basically the area where they traveled. And I want you to notice this part right here is through the Sahara Desert, very dry and arid region. And there were a lot of these books that were left behind, stored in these caves, in this perfect place for materials like parchment and paper to be stored for 2,000 years and not be damaged at all, just because it is so dry and arid. And so they would be traveling through this region with books that looked a lot like this. And they are folding some parchment, they are folding some papyrus, but they're starting to learn paper making that's traveling from China at this time. And they're carrying them in these pouches like this. It's actually a double pouch. Then they hang around their necks, and they would just travel with these books carried with them so that they could basically share this knowledge, this new information that they wanted to share with folks. I want to think about with you guys this idea of what that meant during this time, 2,000 years ago, when the idea of how to access information was totally changing. I want to share with you guys this video that I think is kind of funny. It's about learning about new technologies. This is actually, I think, in Danish, so if you can't hear what they're saying, it's okay. There's the captions are on, the English captions are on. Let's see, I'm going to make sure we're starting from the beginning. There we go.
Ting hele formiddagen?
Ja, jeg beklager at det tar tid. Altså, jeg holder på å legge om til et helt nytt system, og da skal alle ha hjelp på en gang.
Ja.
Så du kommer ikke inn i den, eller?
Nei, den bare ligger der.
Alright, har du forsøkt å åpne den?
Ja, åpne den, altså hvis det hadde vært så enkelt, så hadde jeg jo ikke tilkalt helpdesk, hadde jeg vel?
Nei, det er
Nei.
sant.
Nei. Vil du ha en kopp av en vann?
Nei, det skal være fort gjort.
Ja.
Skal vi se. Du bare gjør der. Sånn.
Ja.
Da er du i gang.
Ja, altså så langt kom jeg også.
Ok.
Ikke sant? Men så stoppet det opp, og så var jeg redd for at noe av teksten skulle forsvinne, så jeg turte ikke å gå videre.
Åja, ok. Nei, men du skjønner at inni her, så ligger det kanskje flere hundre sider med lagret tekst. Så for å komme videre, så tar du tak i et ark på den måten her, og så liksom blar du over på neste side sånn. Da fortsetter teksten der.
Jeg blar, altså.
Du blar, ja.
Men når jeg skal tilbake da?
Ja, da bare blar du tilbake igjen. Tar tak der. Der. Så er du tilbake til den teksten du hadde, sa ikke noe.
Ok, så den slutter der, og så fortsetter den der, ja. Ok, men når jeg skal avslutte for dagen, hva gjør jeg da?
Da bare slår du sammen permene
Ja?
på den måten der. Sånn. Da er den lukket der, ligger alt lagret inni der.
Altså, jeg risikerer ikke å miste noe av teksten her nå,
Nei,
altså.
alt ligger lagret inni her nå.
Ja.
Når du i tilfelle setter fyr på, eller ja, det er kanskje litt sannsynlig.
Ja, ok. Nei, men for det er noe med det at når du har holdt på med skriftruller,
Ja.
så tar det litt grann tid å konvertere til å bla i en bøk. Ja, whatever. Ja, men du, en til før du går. Jeg vil bare gå gjennom en gang til. Altså, jeg åpner sånn,
Ja, riktig.
og så, hva du kalte det?
Blar.
Jeg blar,
Ja, blar videre.
blar frem og tilbake. Og
Teksten der ligger der helt.
ja. Og når jeg er ferdig, så bare lukker jeg den.
Oi.
Flott. Kjempefint.
Ja, flott det.
Ja, men du, vent, ikke sant? Nå er den sånn igjen, nå får jeg ikke åpnet den.
Du må åpne fra andre siden.
Så det er ikke likegyldig, det, altså.
Du må åpne fra den siden der. Sånn. Der. Der er den åpen.
Ja vel.
Har du lest manualen, eller?
Manualen?
Jeg skal følge med som manual og som brukerveiledning. Det sitter den der. Der, vet du.
Å ja,
I
den,
står
ja.
alt sammen.
Ja, men ikke sant, der har du samme problemet. Får den ikke opp.
Det skulle du kanskje ha tenkt på.
I just love that video because it's just a reminder of,
It always starts over when you just progress it.
this idea of this being a new technology. So there was a time when opening a book like this might have been a little bit complicated for people trying to figure out how to make it work. When it comes to Coptic bindings, the main difference here is that they're taking a rectangular structure, and instead of just folding pages into these rectangular structures, they're actually being bound along the spine of these folded pages. So you can see sort of like, it looks a little bit like a braid of the binding, and this is really a very new way of creating books, and in ways that could be expandable too. So we're not talking about just a few simple folded pages that makes a thin book, but in this way this book could be as big as you really want it to be. Just a few examples of leather coverings, parchment. So this is also adaptable to a lot of different materials in a lot of different places in the world too. And there are some new, some contemporary examples of how now librarians and bookbinders are studying these old book structures and repurposing them. A couple of different types of sewing, and one of the reasons I wanted to show this was that there isn't like one right way to do a Coptic binding. If any of you have taken a bookbinding workshop, they'll teach you how to make a Coptic binding. That's just one way. But if you look at these historic examples, every single book has a different binding. It really has to do with the person who was binding it and what they wanted to do with it. So it's mainly about this type of stitch, this linking stitch. You can go in circles, you can go in diagonals. So there are all kinds of different ways that you could go about in approaching this kind of book structure. I want to show book examples of two friends of mine who have taken this book structure into contemporary artwork now. Dan Essig, a lot of you guys might know him. He is a book artist who has taken a very traditional approach to Coptic binding with the wood covers and then sort of adapted them into his own artwork. It's become very sculptural. So you can see the book right here that's become kind of a reliquary. And then the book binding is actually right underneath here. So it's like a tiny little book that opens up, it stays open. Another little reliquary with multiple books. And I think this is one of his more recent ones. It's basically a wooden sculpture. And I have a close-up of this is the Coptic binding right here. You can see basically it's a tiny little Coptic binding book adapted into like today's purposes into his own artwork. And then another friend of mine is Ali, who went to University of Iowa with me, who's exploring laser cutting pages and parchment, but also just using the Coptic binding as his structure. And then let's talk a little bit about the way that I've adapted to Coptic binding and my scrolls. So I've used some of this binding style in my books and a lot of the blank books and a few of my sketchbooks and stuff like that, which is really a lot of fun to explore. But I am more of a book artist where I explore content in my books too. And so when I first started out, I printed books in a very traditional format. And so here are a couple of examples here. What you're seeing up here is what's called a do-si-do. And it's a book that has two bindings along two sides. So it opens in this way. If you flip it over, it opens in the other way. And the other side is the original story, which is written in Chinese. So the original story is Chinese, and then if you flip it over, you get the English translation. So I really like this Coptic format that works better than a scroll, of course. But this is basically where I started off with learning book structures and some really basic, simple little chapbooks too. So this is all hand-set metal type, with a little wood engraving in the end. Your basic Western style chapbook. But then I ended up exploring more imagery in my work, and I really wanted to think about how to create these kind of landscapes. And so it's a little bit hard to see in this image, so I'm glad I brought the book itself, but this is an accordion book that can then be opened up either page by page, or you can see it as like one long landscape. And it's about animals traveling. It's a quote by Thoreau. All animals are a part of our, how does it go? I'm going to read it to you. They are all beasts of burden, in a sense, Thoreau once remarked of animals, each one carrying a portion of our thoughts. So that is how my traditional codex books sort of started evolving. This is another example. I don't have a slide of this one, but it is basically a long drawing that I then converted into sort of this landscape accordion folding format that you can kind of play around with a little bit. Oh, there it is. Which led me to basically my final year in grad school at University of Iowa, where I wanted to explore the scroll format even more. And this is when I created this scroll called the Bad Sparrow, and here it is in person. You're welcome to play with it a little bit. It is 25 feet long, and it is full of imagery. It's a little story that I'm telling about animals coming together to wage war. And for my thesis, it was really about thinking about how the difference is within reading in a scroll format or a codex format. So I created a scroll of this book, but then I also created the codex version of it. So you can flip through it page by page, or you can scroll through it as a scroll. Something that I noticed that was really frustrating about this particular format, though, is that just like the little video that I just showed you, we don't actually remember how to activate scrolls anymore. And what I've noticed is that when I hand this to somebody, they have a really hard time. It seems simple because I've been doing this for years, but they really have a really hard time trying to figure out how to navigate through this scroll and make it work so that you're not like rolling it off the end of the table and this isn't falling off the end of the table. And what was frustrating to me was seeing how the structure itself was so distracting that nobody paid any attention to the story that was in the book anymore. So I felt like in some ways that made this a little bit of a failure because it wasn't really doing the job that I wanted it to do. So that was kind of disappointing. That was how I ended my graduate school. It was a great feat, but then I came to Asheville and I went to see a show, a band play at Warren Wilson College within the first year of being here. And it was Anna and Elizabeth, and they are a band that plays old time music, and they had something called a cranky, which kind of blew my mind. And what I learned about the cranky is that it is rooted in this Appalachian region, is that they were following up on this tradition of creating these scrolls, these long scrolls that were held in boxes that would basically tell the story visually as they were singing these old Appalachian ballads. And so this was apparently part of a tradition of traveling bands through the Appalachian Mountains where they would basically do the same thing. They would sing their songs, but also have a cranky along that would tell the story visually in a way that would help kind of create almost like a full show. And so that's when I decided to try my hand in trying to create some way to make this scroll work better. Got me super excited. And so that's when I made this scroll, or this cranky, that is basically the exact same scroll but put in a box that is now suddenly a lot more accessible. You can really see the story, you can pay attention to it. I made a little drawer that holds this codex, so you can still kind of do that same exploration. What's the difference between seeing it as a scroll and seeing it as a codex? Now this is a project that took like a good 2 solid years of a lot of focus and the time that I had with the privilege of being in grad school, which doesn't really happen when you move to a place like Asheville and need to pay some bills, right? So I had to switch gears a little bit and try to figure out how to make these in a smaller way, in a more accessible way, so that I could make a living and also just get some of these done and out the door and just to be able to share a lot more of it with a lot more people. So I went a little bit smaller, and this is one with all type called Lead Army. These are going to be here for the rest of this morning, by the way. You guys are welcome to come and play with these. Here's another small one called The Calling. It's about a little squirrel, a little mountain squirrel that finds its way from the city to the mountains. And so what I created are these small boxes where you have a handle that's a little bit more manageable. And I think of these as sort of like little personal crankies. So instead of being a part of a larger show, you just sort of take this home, you put it on your bookshelf, and you have your own little private moment. It's like more like reading a book. You know, it's sort of like a one-on-one personal experience rather than an audience like you would with a traveling band or something like that. I moved on from there to create another one called Bio Bay. This is the wooden version. This is also in wood, but it's in green. But this is a story of kayaking through mangrove forest in Puerto Rico and seeing the bioluminescence. They are not all prints. Most of them are made from prints, but this is one that's made from entirely drawing. And this is about a memory that I had of being a child in Taiwan, thinking about being out in the rice paddies and seeing the water buffaloes out in the rice paddy. This is the only one that I made that's just an individual drawing. It's on Japanese paper. They're all actually on Japanese paper. You can see it better on here because it's really the best material for this kind of a scrolling format. And this is the one that I've most recently finished. You can see up on the screen here what it looks like if you see the entire scroll framed and hung on a wall. This one is about 5 feet long, and this is about the size of it in a cranky format. And this is a little story about the Cherokee legend of what are people called Moon-Eyed people. It's apparently a group of people who used to live here long before the Cherokee even came into this region. They encountered them briefly, and then they left. And it's turned into kind of an interesting project for me. I don't think I'm quite finished with that one, so I'm coming back to it. So I decided to do the same thing with this one to create a codex version, to go back to sort of those original roots of saying, what does this feel like if I were to read it in a codex version as opposed to a scroll, just flipping through the pages and stuff like this. I just like that kind of exploration of materials and tools. And then I am working on one now, so I'm kind of like continuing on this journey of crankies and coming back to this place where I first discovered them with a band, working with a musician right now to create a cranky based on a song. And this is just one piece of it. It's turning out to be, it was supposed to be about 10 feet long, but it's kept growing. It's about 20 feet long right now. And I'm in the process of it, and I have a little link here. I'm going to show you the proof printing process of the first 6 feet, and it's at my Instagram. So if you want to follow me along and see this progress, you can come and follow me along on Instagram. I think it should be finished in May or June, and I'm hoping to have some sort of a performance with the musician so that we can actually like perform it and show it. So I'm just going to play this link real quick to show you what it looks like to print. I'm hand printing this because it's just a proof, but when I finish putting the final prints, it'll actually go through a printing press. But I'm just doing a proof just to see what it looks like so far. So that wraps up my slideshow. I'm happy to take any questions. Yeah.
How long is your print?
On my press?
Right.
Not long enough.
Okay.
I actually just last week went to the store and bought an 8-foot long board, and I'm gonna see if I think it'll work, but I'm gonna see if I can take out the printing bed of my press and put in this 8-foot long one so that I can print 8 feet. I'm pretty sure it's possible. I'll let you know. Yeah.
You make a jump to crankies, and with obviously the woodworking involved, is that a big learning curve for you, or did you find that everything that you've been learning as an artist kind of lends itself to do that intuitively?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So when I first started, it was like with this kind of structure, with the bookish structure, right? So this is more like what I learned when I was in grad school. What's really helped is that BFA from East Carolina University in sculpture. I didn't really do a lot of woodworking then, but I did learn enough to make some trouble and make what I need. I think this is something that I might actually return to this because I feel like my woodworking skills are like okay. They're like good enough to make what I need, but I don't like seeing that part because I feel like this is not really showcasing this work really well. So I'm probably going to return to some of this, but the woodworking is something that I did need to learn a little bit more about. I've got a mini wood shop in my print studio set off to the side. Everything's just very small. Got a tiny little table saw, a tiny little drill press, and a tiny little saw. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah. I'm cutting mostly from linoleum blocks. I've tried a couple of different types of rubber blocks and wood blocks, but I keep going back to the linoleum. One of the reasons is because for this new one that I'm working on right now, I can actually buy a 20-foot long roll of linoleum, which is hard to do with any other material. Yeah. All right, if that's it, I'm going to leave these out, and you guys are welcome. They are all touchable. Every single thing on this table is touchable. Oh, you have one more question?
What's your Instagram?
Jessica C. White. And that is also my website, too. If you want to come to my website and take a look, I'm going to be posting more there. And then there's some other videos of my work in my studio at my website, too. Thanks, Mike. All right, thank you guys so much.